Hello to our audience around the world. Thanks for joining us today for a webinar on a very, very important topic of Expedia Media Solutions, the traveler's path to purchase. We have exciting new data that is a cross-country comparison from the United States, United Kingdom, and Canada, and we'll be diving into that research. My name is Sean O'Neill. I'm the editor-in-chief of tnooz. I'm joined by co-founder Gene Quinn in Connecticut. We'll be hearing from our presenter from Expedia Media Solutions shortly. I want to dive into this data, so I'll just have a few preliminary notes. You'll be hearing today's webinar, and afterward we will be sending you a video replay. You will be able to watch the video and review a PDF of the slides. So there's going to be a lot of data here. I've seen this presentation 2 times already. There's a lot of details on these slides. Do not worry, don't panic. You will be able to review it and share it with your colleagues afterward. We also will have a question and answer session. So at any point today, if you have a question, you can go into your GoToWebinar control panel there and you'll see a drop-down menu for questions. Type in your questions whenever you think about it and send it through. And in our Q&A session at the end, I will pass them along to our presenter. We are also going to ask a couple of poll questions. This will help us adjust our presentation to make sure we're better at addressing the audience that we have online today. So our first poll question is right now. You'll see in your GoToWebinar panel, you can please participate in our poll. Where are you located? Please select one of the following. Are you located in North America, Europe, Latin America, or Asia Pacific? We thank everyone for joining us no matter where they are in the world. We understand because of the time difference, some people will be waiting to get the webinar replay. And so naturally these results with a large proportion, 2/3 in North America and about 1/3 in Europe, make sense. But if you're joining us in Latin America or Asia, thank you so much. And we know the webinar replay will be shared around the world. One more question, and we'll dive into the presentation. What travel business segment do you represent? Are you a supplier, a travel agency, a travel management company, a corporate buyer? Are you in media or advertising services? Are you an online travel agency or something else? Please select one of the following so that we can better address the crowd and the kind of questions and data that you're going to be most interested in today. It appears about 1 out of 5 of you are suppliers. About 1 out of 5 of you represent OTAs. 11% are in media or advertising services. About 8% are travel agencies or TMCs. Regardless of which segment you're in, I think there's going to be great data for you today. Again, as I said, I've seen this a couple of times, and I'm looking forward to this because there's a lot of surprising information. So I'm now going to hand it over to our presenter, who's joining us from Bellevue, Washington. Matthew Reichak has been working at Expedia Media Solutions for quite some time. He's really delved into this data as Global Vice President, Product and Analytics. And I now turn the presentation over to Matthew.
Great. Well, thanks very much, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. So as Sean indicated, I'm Vice President of Media Product and Analytics at Expedia Media Solutions. I've worked at Expedia for about 5 years overall, and we always like to include a fun fact when we present. This is something that our marketing team is very insistent on, and my fun fact, and this is one I've had for quite a while now, so I might need to change it up. But when I was in college, I was in a West African dance troupe, and I actually got paid to perform at other schools. And so it's a real shame here that we're on a webinar with no video, because you would see some very fancy footwork. So with that, let's go to the next slide. So hopefully all of you know Expedia, but you may not know my group, which is Expedia Media Solutions. So we're the digital advertising arm of Expedia. So we work with marketing partners to help them get their message across to Expedia Inc.'s large and growing audience. And when people hear Expedia Media Solutions, they often think of brand Expedia, but over time, our footprint has expanded. So here we just wanted to kind of talk to you the way we talk to our marketing partners, which is around our global network and reach. And here we're presenting Comscore data, and you can see that from a traffic perspective, our footprint goes well beyond Expedia with respect to different brands like Hotels.com and Hotwire, and then around the globe with brands like What If and eBookers and so forth. So this just gives you a sense of our scale, and that network piece is something that we emphasize a lot when talking to marketing partners. Next slide, please. Now, because we're part of Expedia, we have access to a vast amount of exclusive first-party data that our partners can't get anywhere else. And so our partners often come to us and ask us, what kind of trends are we seeing with respect to user behavior and the traveler's path to purchase? So these subjects can range from today's topic around path to purchase to thinking about media attribution, specifically within a travel context, as well as how to think about the very complicated multi-screen cross-device environment that we all navigate today. So we like to do research and provide sage counsel based on the data that we have, but then a few times a year we like to take a bit of a step back and look at the entire travel ecosystem. And so we partner with third-party research firms like Comscore and Millward Brown Digital because we feel like it's important to step outside the sort of proverbial four walls of Expedia and look at the entire landscape. And so that's kind of a foundational principle around why we do these types of studies. And our premise is that by doing these research endeavors and by sharing this kind of information and data, that a rising tide lifts all boats, and what's good for our marketing partners and for the industry is also good for us. And so that's kind of something that we like to emphasize. As Sean said, there's a lot of data here. You will get the deck, so I'd encourage you just to kind of kick back and relax as we go through it. Next slide, please. And if you find this kind of research helpful, please follow us at Expedia Media. And we also really value your feedback. And in fact, this study is a direct reflection of feedback we've gotten from people like you in the past. And so we really take that to heart, and that really shapes and informs the research that we do. Now, we do a couple of these studies a year, and so by following us, you'll get a chance to get the latest and greatest. We also have white papers and blog posts and updates to projects that we've done in the past. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to jump right into it. So for context, this is the fourth iteration of the Traveler's Path to Purchase, and we started this journey back in 2009. And this study is a little bit different, and I want to highlight a couple ways that it's changed. So the prior three studies were all focused on vacation package shopping, so multi-item bookings. And one of the pieces of feedback we got from our partners was, while we love vacation packages as much as the next person, we're actually interested in any type of travel booking. And so they asked us, hey, could you kind of take a broader cut? And so that's what we're looking at here. So this study on the path to purchase, it covers any type of travel booking. So that's the first key difference. The second key difference is that the prior studies all focused on one individual geography. And this time we're looking across three geographies, as Sean mentioned. So we're looking at the UK, US, and Canada. And this comparative study is interesting because, as you'll see in the slides that follow, there are some cases where the three geographies march in lockstep, and there are lots of similarities with respect to the data. But then there are other cases where one geography may be a bit of an outlier, and so we'll pause and dwell on that a little bit as we get through the deck. And then lastly, the third key difference with this study is that there's a much heavier emphasis on mobile. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why we partner with Comscore in this study, because they've got great mobile data. Now, for those of you who don't know Comscore's research in detail, Comscore uses a combination of behavioral data panels on the one hand and custom surveys on the other. And so we like this approach because we think this presents a really nice 360-degree view of consumer behavior. And the behavioral data panels that you see here tell you what people actually did online. And then the custom surveys get at that very critical question of intention, why they did what they did online, or why consumers and bookers think, or why they think they did what they did online. And so I think between those two, you get a really nice holistic view of the shopping behavior. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to start at the 30,000 foot level, and we're going to kind of set the table here, and we're going to talk about travel content consumption trends. Next slide. And here we're talking not just about travel content consumption, but about any type of digital content consumption. And just to orient folks, for the slides to come, we're looking at the UK on the left, the US in the middle, and Canada on the right. And for the UK, you see 50 million digital UK users per month consuming almost 240 billion minutes of digital content. In the US, that's almost 260 million users, 1.5 trillion minutes. And in Canada, about 30 million and almost 150 billion minutes. Now, just to kind of contextualize things around, can we go back one slide, please? Just to contextualize things here, what that means is that's about 3 to 4 days per month of digital content consumption. And in terms of the reach of the digital audience, it's about 78 to 81% of each country's total population. Okay, next slide, please. Now, great news for everyone on this webinar and for the travel industry. The vast majority of digital content consumers look at some form of travel content. And here you see on the left, in the UK, 75% of UK users consuming travel content, 70% in Canada on the right, and then more than 60% in the US. Now, this is, we're early in the presentation, but this is one of the first places where we see a bit of a differentiation across the three geographies. And our hypothesis here is that this is really a function of a difference in vacation time across the three countries. So according to the Center for Economic and Policy Research, in the US, the average worker has about 10 days of paid vacation time plus 6 paid holidays, versus in the UK, those two numbers add up to about 28 days. So, in the US, less vacation time, a little less travel content consumption. Next slide. Now, some more good news for the travel industry. The content consumption trends are really, really robust. So here we see that in the UK, about 2.4 billion minutes spent on travel content consumption, up 44% year on year. In the US, 8.7 billion, up 41%. A little over 800 million in Canada, up 18%. And any one of a number of industries would be thrilled to have a primary engagement metric like this one up 20 to 40% plus. And I think what this means is that not only do people find this kind of content really valuable, but they're hungry for it and they want more of it. Next slide. Okay, so we know that the online travel audience is big, and based on our prior studies, we also know it's becoming increasingly more mobile. So we wanted to look again to see how the reach of mobile devices has increased over time. So here what we're looking at, again, is a reach number. So it's the percentage of total digital unique users accessing content but either via desktop or mobile. And you can see in the UK, a 15-point improvement from 67% to 82%, desktop flattish. In the US, desktop flattish to down, a bit higher mobile penetration a year ago, and that ticks up a bit further. And then Canada, slightly lagging with respect to mobile penetration, but a nice move up, 10 points, and desktop down by a decent amount. Next slide. Now, one of the questions we often get from our marketing partners is around how should we think about or navigate the multi-device landscape, and where should we invest our resources, and what should our strategy be? And so we wanted to dig into this question of multi-device usage. And again, this is interesting because here we see a bit of a differentiation across the geographies. So before, the US was a bit of an outlier. Here we see that the UK is markedly different with respect to multi-device, and over 54% of users accessing travel content via multiple devices, with mobile only in the UK actually shrinking. Now compare that versus the US and Canada, where you see multi-device about 29 to 30%, and you see in the US by far the highest percentage of mobile only usage, and then in Canada a nice move up in mobile only as well. So interesting to see the divergence here, and I guess it's an open question from our perspective. Is the UK mix a bit of an outlier, and will that revert to something approximating the US and Canada, or conversely, will the US and Canada grow their multi-device share? And so it's interesting to see this, and this is something that we'll need to track in upcoming iterations. Next slide, please. Over to you, Sean, for a polling question.
Yes, thanks. What does your device strategy include? If you could please vote in our poll whether you have a holistic across devices strategy, if your device strategy includes something separate for desktop and mobile, or if you have a desktop only strategy. We appreciate your answers to these poll questions. So it appears that about 2/3 of our attendees have a strategy that's holistic across devices. About 27% have strategies that are separate for desktop and mobile. Matthew, are these results surprising to you, or is that kind of in line with what you found at Expedia Media Solutions when dealing with clients?
It's fairly in line, but I will say it's also very encouraging. I think that our partners have moved very aggressively on mobile, either with us and on their own initiatives, and it's great to see that the audience here has taken a holistic approach. I think as you'll see in the data that comes, it's something that you can never kind of stand pat with either, and so you always need to be evolving that over time. So I think the holistic approach is great to see, but I'd encourage people to continue to kind of refine and push the envelope there, because as we'll see in the slides to come, some of these trends are not going to revert anytime soon.
Okay, that makes sense, Matthew. Thank you.
Okay, so before we were talking about the reach of mobile devices. Now we're going to switch a little bit and talk about total minutes of travel content consumption. And so in this slide, what we're looking at is a graph for the UK, and you see that red line for mobile minutes up about 66% over that 14, 15-month horizon, with desktop, call it flattish to down. And we would expect that mobile travel content consumption will exceed desktop, call it in the next 6 to 9 months. And so mobile will be firmly in the driver's seat in the UK. Now contrast that with the next slide for the US, and what you see is that inflection point, or that crossover moment, happened over a year ago. So back in September 2015, mobile minutes of travel content consumption actually exceeded desktop, and so desktop flattish to down, mobile growth very robust. And we think these are very durable trends and won't revert anytime soon. And so in line with that polling question that Sean posed, we think it's really important for the audience to have a heavy focus on mobile, because as you see, 2 out of the 3 geographies, mobile is clearly in the driver's seat, and we don't expect that to change anytime soon. Now, if we contrast that with the next slide for Canada, we see a slightly different picture. Desktop, call it flattish to down. Mobile growth is actually pretty robust here, call it 100% over the time horizon in the graph. But because of the absolute delta or gap between the two, we think it'll be another year or two before you see that crossover moment in Canada. But we're pretty convinced that will happen in Canada as well, and that all 3 geographies will look somewhat similar in the years to come. Next slide, please. Now, one of the questions we often get around mobile is that key question of browser versus app, and our partners, often ask us, where should we be investing our time? How should we think about the differences between the two, and what should our strategy be? And here too, we see some interesting regional differences. So, UK and Canada, travel content consumption on the browser is the majority. So 64% in the UK and 74% in Canada. And here, just as a reminder, we're looking at the total minutes of travel content consumption. Now contrast that with the US, where about 2/3 of that mobile travel content consumption is happening via the app. Now, our hypothesis going into the study was that user behavior on the tablet versus the phone was very different, and we thought that tablet would skew on the browser side. And if we go to the next slide, that's exactly what the data showed us. So 90% plus of mobile content consumption on the tablet happening via the browser, and across all 3 geographies. And if we compare that versus the smartphone, you see a bit of a difference, but the smartphone very much stronger presence of the app. I think it's interesting to see the difference between the US and the UK and Canada. So US, 70% of minutes via the app on the phone versus just 47% in Canada and 38%, or rather 38% in Canada, 47% in the UK. And now I think what'll be interesting to see over the coming years is how these numbers change. And, I guess on the one hand, you could say, well, as phones get larger, as their capabilities increase, as wireless networks get faster and faster, perhaps the US will start to look more like the UK and Canada with respect to the browser being the dominant access method on the phone. Or conversely, you could take a slightly different view and say, as companies continue to improve their apps the way Expedia has done and roll those out globally, perhaps the UK and Canada will look a bit more like the US over time. And so I think that's an open question, and that's another one that we want to follow up on in subsequent studies. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so we've been talking about travel content consumption trends, minutes of consumption, and how bookers and shoppers are engaging with travel content, mobile versus desktop. Now we want to get to that critical question of that path to purchase and what are the key influencers along that path to purchase. Let's go to the next slide. And here, there's a lot of data here, so let me just orient folks here. So what we're looking at is the overall engagement over that 6-week period prior to the booking. So we're looking at that 45-day period. On the left-hand side, we see the number of visits to travel sites made by bookers during that 45 days. And you see an awful lot of travel site visitation. So 121 sites in the UK, 140 in the US, 161 in Canada. And then on the right-hand side in the bar charts, what we're looking at are the average travel site visits per week. And what you can see is a steady sort of increase in engagement, which is fairly intuitive, but we want to call it out because you do see that while engagement is high throughout the process, that there is that kind of growing intensity into the weeks leading up to booking across all 3 geographies. Next slide, please. So here I'll turn it back to Sean for a polling question.
Thank you, Matthew. Which channels do you push your content through? Please select all that apply. Which channels do you push your content through? Your website, online travel agencies, travel information sites like TripAdvisor, search, social media? You can choose more than one option. Thank you for participating in our poll today. We appreciate it. It appears that 90% of you use your website as one channel. About half of you use online travel agencies. 44% use travel information sites like TripAdvisor. 66% use search. About 76% use social media. So, Matthew, maybe we could quickly chat a little bit about this. Is this sort of align with a typical mix of how people push their content through?
By and large, yes. I don't know if we always have perfect insight with respect to what our partners are doing, but I guess the one, we'll talk a bit about social media later.
The social media number is really surprising there to me anyway.
Which one?
The social media number?
Yeah, that one seems pretty high to me, and it's something that we have a perspective on, and I'll share that when we talk a bit about that topic. But the other numbers look relatively in line. I guess naturally I'd like to see a bit more on the OTA side, but so be it.
Well, one thing before you go on, Matthew, I'd just like to remind our listeners, if you have questions at any time, you can ask them in the questions box. We know there's a lot of data here, and you'll get the slides within about a day's time, so don't panic. So back to you, Matthew.
Great. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so here we're looking at similar data to the prior slide, but we're cutting it in a different way. And again, I just want to orient folks. So we're looking at average visits to travel categories per week by the different categories. So week 6, week 5, etc. Now, we had to cut the data in a slightly different way, in large part because of the traffic volume differences across the different categories. And so here what we're looking at are the average visits to specific travel categories for bookers who visited a particular category in a particular week. So let me just explain what that means. So if people on the webinar just focus on that 5 weeks out slice and look at the navy blue DMO 2.6 number, what that means is that on average, bookers in the UK who visited a DMO website went to a DMO website 2.6 times that week. It doesn't mean that that same booker who visited a DMO website in week 5 also visited in week 6 and week 4. So it's really about, for those users who engage with a particular category in a particular week, what's the frequency there? And we have I think about three slides of this data. I'm going to kind of go through this pretty quickly, but for those of you who are interested, when you download the slides, you'll be able to dig into detail and look at the trends for your particular category. And I think some of that data is pretty interesting. Okay, so here you see week 6, 5, and 4. You see a gradual buildup in terms of visitation trends. If we go to the next slide, week 3 and week 2, you see how the numbers start to creep up, as we talked about with respect to the engagement side of things across all 3 geographies. And then to the next slide, we see, week 1 in the week of booking, that growing intensity. Now, I kind of breezed through that, and I'd encourage you all to download the study and to look at it for your category. But we also wanted to provide a consolidated view of the overall kind of visitation mix. And so if we go to the next slide, you can see the roll up, and you can call this the shameless plug slide, but this is what the ComScore data showed, and that's that OTAs have the most engagement throughout that 45-day path to booking, and pretty consistently the case across all 3 geographies. So about a third of folks going to OTAs. The next closest category is the travel information category, about 21 to 26%, followed by accommodations, airlines, etc. Next slide, please. Okay, so before we were talking about visitation trends based on the panel data from ComScore. Now we wanted to get at this question of why people went to certain sites. So the best way to figure that out, that question of intent, is to ask people. So that's what we did here. And so we asked people, when did you use each resource for the recent booking of your trip? And we broke that out by a couple different phases of the path to purchase to really understand how that site usage changes over time. And so here, we see that search engines and friends and family recommendations were the most often cited categories by a decent margin, followed by OTAs, airline sites, and hotel sites. And one thing just to note for the audience is that the percentages are actually pretty consistent for the most part across all 3 geographies. And that's interesting because it shows that there's a real kind of consistent view here with respect to usage. Now, if we go to the next slide, now we're getting to the research phase, not the inspiration phase. And you see that search engines and friends and family drop by over half. And then it's really over to OTAs, hotel sites, and airline sites during that research phase as people are figuring out where they want to go and what their options are. And then as the user gets a bit further down the funnel in the next slide, in that consideration phase right before booking, you see search engines and friends and family drop even further, and it's OTAs, hotel sites, and airline sites across the 3 geographies. And then when it comes time to convert on the next slide, we see mom and dad close early, and it's OTAs, airline sites, and hotel sites kind of taking over here. And if we go to the next slide, please. Now, in the polling, we had some interesting data around social. And so, from our perspective, no study of online user behavior would be complete without some discussion of social. And so here, too, we asked people, did you use social media in your travel research process? And what we found was a little surprising, and maybe in contradistinction to the earlier survey results, but we found that only 11% of bookers said they used social media in their research process. Now, we then wanted to figure out, okay, well, for those users who said they use social media, what did you use it for? And so we asked across a number of categories, when did you perform certain activities using social media? And you can see across 3 different phases, the responses, depending on the activity, were fairly consistent. And here we're looking at data across all 3 geographies. But for activities like viewed pictures and videos or asked for feedback, you see that the usage is the greatest at the beginning, and then it drops off pretty meaningfully from, call it like a 20 to high 20% range down to a mid-single digit range right before booking. And I guess one of the preliminary conclusions at this point in the study to call out is that based on this slide data and some of the earlier data around mobile, if you are spending almost as much time thinking about social as you are about mobile, you're probably over-investing in social and under-investing in mobile. Next slide, please. Okay, so we talked a bit about travel content consumption trends in mobile. Then we addressed this question of site visitation trends and influencers along the path to purchase. Now we want to get to the heart of the matter around destination influencers. So if we go to the next slide. Again, we wanted to start at the 30,000 foot level. And in order to do that and provide some context, we just asked people prior to booking your final destination, how many other destinations did you consider? And here too, we saw some interesting regional differences. Over half the people in the UK and Canada said they considered 2 or more destinations, versus in the US, about 2/3 considered just one. Now here, we'd harken back to the earlier discussion of vacation time. And so in the US, folks have a little less vacation time, maybe not considering as exotic or complicated travel itineraries. And so that might account for the difference across the 3 countries. Next slide, please. So we then wanted to understand, okay, well, where are bookers researching? And so here we leveraged some proprietary ComScore technology that looked at the semantic content of a page. And what we found was that Europe did perform very, very strongly across all 3 countries. So no surprise in the UK, 61% of bookers researching European destinations, followed by Asia and Latin America. In the US came out first, but not by much, 31% versus Europe at 27%, and then Latin America and Asia. And then in Canada, Europe again led the way at 33%, followed by Latin America and Asia. And interesting to note, so not only did Europe do very, very well, but Canadians look to be a little bit more adventurous and willing to consider destinations a bit further afield. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, one of the key things we want to get at is what's driving that destination decision here. And what we found in the data when we asked bookers to rank the top 3 resources that influenced their selection was that OTAs were the most influential online resource. So friends and family performed very strongly. You can see across all 3 geographies. But OTAs on the online side, very, very strong as well. So in the US, OTAs led the way, followed by airline sites, and then friends and family. In the UK, friends and family first, followed by OTAs, and then search engines. And then in Canada, friends and family first, OTAs second, and then airline sites. Next slide, please. All right, so thus far, we've covered quite a bit of ground from content consumption trends to influencers along the path to purchase. Now we want to get to one of my favorite topics, which is advertising. And again, our goal in this research is really to understand the landscape and to help provide guidance to our partners so they can meet their strategic goals and maximize their returns for their businesses. So if we go to the next slide. So some good news for marketers. Advertising does influence the destination decision. And so here, what we did, again, just to get at this question of influence, was to ask people, were you influenced if you were considering more than one location? And a little over 30% overall said yes. So 30% in the UK, 27% in the US, and 38% in Canada. And now, if anything, we think these numbers understate the true impact of advertising, because generally speaking, people like to think that they know their own minds and that advertising influences the other person. So if we go to the next slide, in order to kind of get at that question, we asked a slightly different question, which was, did you notice any advertising while you were shopping for travel? And here, the number is meaningfully higher. So 59% of bookers in the UK recalled seeing an ad while shopping or booking, 47% in the US, and 64% in Canada. And interesting here to see the US a bit of an outlier versus the other two countries. And I guess it's an open question. Are we in the US more focused on the one hand, or on the other, are we just a little less observant? And I'll leave that to folks on the webinar. Maybe we can have a polling question about that next time around. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've been talking about the influence of advertising in that destination decision. And Sean, thank you for the chuckle. I appreciate it. It's early here on the West Coast. We then want to get this question of when's the right time to engage the travel shopper. And so here what we did was we were looking across all three geographies, and we asked people, when did you notice advertising related to a variety of different travel services? So this is data across all three geographies broken out. The line charts are by hotel, air, package, car rental, and cruise. And you can see that irrespective of the product itself, across all three phases, the dynamic is pretty similar. That the bookers notice ads the most at the beginning, and then over time that declines. And now that's fairly intuitive. At the beginning, people are the most open and malleable. They haven't acquired as much information, and their memory banks are a little less full. And then over time, there's a bit of a crowding out process. People are more dialed in on what they're looking at. And in the law of, in economics, we talk about declining marginal utility, and I think that's what you see here in this slide as well, across the three geographies by these different products. And so now I think, next slide, please. Well, turn it back to Sean for a polling question.
Yeah, this is our last poll, and then we'll be heading into questions soon. Where does the majority of your advertising spending go? Are you spending the majority of your advertising spend at the top of the funnel, building awareness? Are you doing it in the middle of the funnel with research and the consideration stage? Or are you doing it at the bottom of the funnel, driving for conversion with the majority of your advertising spend? One question that's come in from the audience is, what does DMO stand for? And that was on a slide and something Matthew referenced, and that's Destination Marketing Organization, sort of the local regional partners that help promote destinations. So where does the majority of your advertising spend go? It looks like about 46% are at the top of the funnel with building awareness. About a third are at the bottom of the funnel, driving for conversion. And we have about 70% in the middle in the research and consideration stage. So turning it back over to Matthew for the final thrust.
Great, thank you. That's really interesting data, actually. Maybe we can talk about that during the Q&A at the end. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So here we wanted to take a slightly more quantitative cut. And so, similar trends to the prior slide with respect to when people noticed ads. But here what we're looking at in the bar charts are average number of weekly ad impressions by geography across all three, and the average recall rate by geography in those line charts. And I think what's interesting here, you see that as ad impressions increase, the recall rate decreases, which really illustrates this law of declining marginal utility. And what's also interesting, in the prior slide, around this question of noticing ads, the US was a bit lower than the other geographies, but here, cutting the data in a slightly different way and with a slightly different focus, you see that the US was pretty close to the top in terms of recall rate at the beginning, and then throughout that journey, the US recall rate stayed the highest across all three geographies. So, it's an open question. Were people, when they said they noticed ads only to the tune of 47% earlier, open question whether or not what they recollected was actually true. But again, interesting to see that impact, and again, that speaks to the fact that as people get further down the funnel, they're a little less aware of the ad side and more focused on their shopping process. And I think that speaks, I guess, to the survey results. Great to see that highest percentage of folks focusing on top of funnel. But I think what that means is that for folks who are really focused on the bottom of the funnel, they may need to reevaluate that a little bit and take maybe a more holistic approach with respect to where they're spending their time and energies. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've covered quite a bit of ground. You've all been very patient with me, and so now we wanted to wrap up with an actual path to purchase. And we like to look at, an actual user because it's often really interesting to see how these trends play out in one particular path to purchase. And now I love analytics and numbers, and so I would caution you against the law of small numbers, i.e., don't extrapolate based on just one data point. But I think this path to purchase is illustrative of some of the trends we've been looking at throughout the presentation. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to orient folks for a bit, and I'm not going to read off all the websites here, but here what we're looking at are the 45 days or 44 days prior to booking plus the day of booking, so that's 45 days in all. And that very handsome teal on your screen is a desktop impression, the black is a travel desktop impression, and the red is a mobile travel impression. And so day 44, the research process starts. About 5 days go by if we go to the next slide. With no travel engagement, a bit of engagement on orbits on day 36. We go to the next slide. 3 days go by with no engagement. Some more engagement on day 31 and 32. A bit of a pause, day 29. And I think what we've seen at this point is that travel content engagement is episodic. It's not consistent. And so people engage, life intervenes, and then they re-engage a couple days later. If we go to the next slide. We see some mobile on day 24, again, a bit of a pause. And now just on day 21, I just want to focus your attention on those two black listings there. So those are both castles in Ireland. And this is the first time, we're over halfway through that path to purchase in terms of days. This is the first time we've seen a specific destination show up in the user's behavior. And it'll be interesting to see where they wind up over time. But just I'd ask you to remember these two castles in Ireland. So day 20, some more travel content engagement. If we go to the next slide. Bit of a pause here. And next slide, please. That pause is about 7 days in all. Now, here on day 9, we see quite a bit of engagement. And, on day 21, we saw the engagement with two castles in Ireland. Here we see another destination pop up, and that's Canada. So hello, BC, Canada, book now, and Prestige Hotels and Resorts, all in Canada. And so it'll be interesting to see, first someone's looking at Ireland, now they're looking at Canada. And now if we go to the next slide, we'll see how that engagement pattern, ratchets up as we get closer and closer to booking. So quite a bit of engagement here from this point onwards. A lot of orbits. You see some other OTAs show up like Expedia, travel information. Site is that mobile again, mobile a couple times. Pretty heavy orbits this week. If you go to the next slide, and we look and see, where this person wound up going and where they booked. I think the orbits piece is no surprise, but they didn't go to Ireland. They didn't go to Canada. They wound up taking a flight to Cancun, Mexico, and booking the Green Tulum cabanas and gardens. And so interesting to see that, they considered a few different discrete destinations. And I guess the open question is, okay, well, where do they engage with this Cancun content? And clearly, the most likely place where that engagement occurred would have been orbits along their path to purchase. And so I think if we kind of think about this particular path versus the data we saw in the earlier slides, what we see is how that engagement kind of ratchets up over the path to purchase, how that destination decision maybe isn't quite as fixed as you might think. We see the presence of mobile in there, and then we see the kind of the very kind of shopping intensive site visitation trends playing out here for this user as well. So with that, if we go to the next slide, you've all been very patient. I'll just wrap up with 6 key findings. So first, travel content widely consumed across all 3 countries and all saw really strong double-digit growth. So remember that 20 to 40% plus growth across all 3 geographies. And again, we would stress that means people really find a lot of value in this content and they're hungry for it and they want more of it. Second, mobile usage is growing. And we saw that inflection moment in the US in September 2015, and mobile is clearly in the driver's seat in the US and will be shortly in the UK. And we think these trends are really durable. So great to see that the audience has a holistic approach on mobile. Third, travel, really time-consuming purchase. I got tired just looking at all those websites. Bookers visit hundreds of sites in the weeks leading up to a purchase. And that's really important because as you think about it, that gives you as a marketer ample opportunity to engage with that booker. Fourth, OTAs did have the highest engagement across the travel site categories, accounting for about 33% of total site visits. So as you think about your full funnel strategy, the OTA as a platform, I think, is a pretty compelling option. Fifth, nearly a third of, actually a bit more than a third of bookers said they were influenced by advertising when they were considering more than one destination. So for all of you, you really do have a chance to drive the outcomes and meet your strategic goals. And I'd encourage you to be very strategic with respect to how you go after that goal. And then sixth, ad recall is the highest early on in the purchase journey when exposure is the lowest. So with that, if you go to the next slide. Sean mentioned that you'd be getting a copy of the deck. We'd encourage you to download the study if you need to have it in your hands like this moment. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions if there are any from the audience.
Yeah, there are some, Matthew. Thanks for the presentation. Just a couple quick notes. We've had a question from Karina and from Gavin about the definition of content, of travel information content. Now, I understand that's sort of travel information sites are defined as sites like TripAdvisor, National Geographic, etc. Is that right?
Yes, that is right.
So can you describe what you mean by engaged? So some people are wondering how you're defining that in terms of engaged with the content.
Was this in reference to a specific slide?
Let us see here. Is it do you measure like the content is being engaged with by page load, like the email content was open, it was active engagement by clicking on a link? When you're measuring that content is being engaged with, maybe for example Expedia on site, how do you measure that?
I guess it depends on the slide, but we're looking at minutes of travel content consumption for the earlier slides around travel content engagement.
Yeah, let's take that as an example.
Yeah, so and I think what we were looking at it in two different ways. We're looking at it, one, in terms of reach, because reach in some ways is a leading indicator of kind of total engagement, and then we wanted to look at actually total minutes of engagement. So that's what we looked at in those line charts, but also for the app versus browser section, that was also based on total minutes of content engagement on mobile devices. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, the app minutes in the US is remarkably high. Did your data show any particular apps or brands standing out here, or was it fairly evenly distributed across a large number of apps? This is a question from Michael.
So we didn't, I guess in this particular study, we didn't look into specific apps. I think one of our working hypotheses is around some of the airline apps with respect to boarding passes and so forth. And again, I'm not the expert on air apps globally, but our hypothesis is that that usage is much more frequent and common in the U.S. versus the other countries, and that maybe the airlines operating in Canada and the UK, their apps aren't quite as either well distributed or as well designed. But again, that's our hypothesis. We didn't dig into that here in this particular study.
How does metasearch fit into your analysis?
So Meta was a pretty small percentage. I think it was 2 to 3%. So it wasn't enough. I think we lumped that in with OTA because it was such a small subsection. We have looked at Meta in other studies around travel attribution, but in this one, in the data, it was low single digits percentages, and so that was rolled into the OTA piece.
Okay. In the research, what do you consider being a destination? Is it a city, a state, or a country? Patricia is asking.
That's an interesting question. I think it would be, I guess, it's not it can be anything. I think from a destination influencer perspective, what we were looking at was really asking people from their perspective what drove the decision. So we were more focused on the booker's perception as opposed to kind of delimiting it. But my assumption would be it would be the particular destination. So, for example, Cancun, Mexico, not Mexico. London, not the UK, etc.
How do you see the evolution of usage of mobile versus desktop evolving, and in the upcoming year or two?
Yeah, I think our perspective is that mobile will continue to take share from a minutes of engagement perspective. I think this question of cross-device is a tricky one because for shoppers, I think a lot of people engage with the content on mobile devices, and then when it comes time to make perhaps a pretty expensive booking, they may wind up booking on the desktop. But I think that's why, from an attribution perspective, being able to kind of have a solid cross-device attribution strategy is really important. And it's a pretty hard problem to solve. I know that it's been challenging for us, and it's something that we're always trying to refine and think about and improve. But I think that's the tricky part, because your people your target audience is looking on the mobile device, and then it's a question of, okay, how do you make sure that you're not kind of undervaluing that mobile impression, because it will influence the desktop impression.
Makes sense. In the Canadian market, are tour operators such as Air Canada Vacations counted as an airline site or an OTA, given the options that you presented?
That is a very good question, and in that particular case, I'm assuming it's OTA, but I don't know for sure.
Okay.
I need to check the data.
Okay.
No apologies.
Yeah. So you mentioned, we had our last poll question, which was found that the audience said that 46% are spending at the top of the funnel, 17% in the middle of the funnel, and 37% at the bottom of the funnel. And you said that those really focused at the bottom may want to take more of a holistic approach on where they spend their time and energy. Is there an example of some of the? Are you suggesting to do more top of funnel, or sort of middle, or holistic? Is there any balancing you think should be done there?
I guess I would say both. I mean, it looked like top of funnel was pretty well represented, but I think if you think about the slides we presented around the impact of advertising, you'd certainly want to have more in the upper middle part of the funnel. And I think that's a common issue, not just with travel advertising, but advertising writ large. And I think as people tend to kind of attribute value to the last click, that tends to skew people's results. We've done some really great campaigns with the Hawaii Tourism Authority around awareness and so forth, and we think those are pretty powerful. And if you I think from a strategic perspective, if you can have a really compelling top of funnel campaign, and then have other pieces that kind of tie back to that top of funnel campaign in the middle and bottom of the funnel, we think that can be pretty powerful. And we've seen great success kind of marrying different products. So, for example, in the Expedia Media Solutions landscape, that might mean a top of funnel kind of display advertising campaign with some more middle and bottom of the funnel sponsored listings, and those can kind of reinforce each other and drive even better results than any one in isolation, for example.
So as Teresa was listening to you talk, she was wondering whether it seemed like there's increased OTA engagement by travelers closer to booking, and she's wondering if that's an organic phenomenon or whether that's fueled by the paid efforts of the OTAs, because it's known that the OTAs spend a lot of money on marketing.
Yeah, I mean, clearly the marketing is a factor, and as we saw in the study, marketing works, and so that's certainly a contributor. But I guess what I would for Teresa, I would kind of change that question a little bit and say, for partners, what a great way to piggyback off the efforts of the OTA marketing spend, right? And so if we're spending, spending a huge amount of money to drive people to our site, why not kind of leverage that and piggyback on that and get your message heard across a broader range of audiences. And that's been something that's resonated with our customers as well. And the other thing we'd say, and I think we as a company have said this in other places, is that oftentimes the shopper coming to the OTA may not be interested in a particular brand. They want to see what the options are, and so it's a great way to really introduce your brand and your message to a shopper who may not be familiar with it.
Okay, we've had a bunch of great questions. We're not going to be able to answer them all. If you do have additional questions you see on the screen there, you can email us, and we will pass them along to Expedia Media Solutions. Matthew, you mentioned that OTAs have the highest engagement across travel site categories. However, the majority of guests end up booking on hotel websites and airline sites. Nicola Meyer's wondering if that's correct.
I think what you saw is airlines did very well at the booking phase, but I think overall the OTA and hotel sites were pretty similar. I would say that if you look at sort of overall share, I think that kind of squares. And I think there have been other research firms that look at the share of the online pie and what percentage goes to OTAs versus suppliers. And I think one thing that we as Expedia have seen is that we're growing nicely, and so I think from a share perspective, those numbers are probably pretty consistent year to year.
Okay, Airbnb didn't appear in any of the data. Teresa Keegan is wondering, is there a reason for that?
Well, Airbnb is principally the reason why we changed hotels to accommodation sites. So Airbnb would show up there.
All right, thanks. And Christina is wondering, you had the data about social, and she's wondering that some of us in the audience are suppliers with non-OTA distribution. Not everyone attending is with an OTA, and they want to have a robust content strategy. Does your advice? Do you think are you drawing conclusions about how consumers do mobile behavior that sort of goes beyond whether you're participating in an OTA?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, so I think that the idea is that this is for the entire ecosystem, and I think that the conclusions are applicable, no matter what category you're in. And so I think one thing is, people may tend to restrict their thoughts around content distribution to social platforms, but there are other ways to do that as well. And so, for example, we partner with destination management organizations. They've got really great, rich content, and so one of the things we're excited about in 2017 is how do we get that content a broader audience. And so those guys have great content, but they may not have the kind of traffic that they'd like. And so from a distribution perspective, that's where we can come in. And the same holds for brands, right? And I think what marketers are really interested in is that incrementality and what can we provide on top of what they already have, whether it's through their existing channels like social, et cetera. And that's really the goal. And again, it's really about driving returns for the partner.
Adriano is sort of wondering. I'm going to paraphrase what he's saying here, which is that is there any sense of how often you have that kind of example that you had in the American Path to Purchase example, where a person was looking at Ireland, was looking at British Columbia, and then ended up in Cancun? Like, is that just a rare one-off, or are many travelers often considering non-destinations you wouldn't necessarily think of as in the comp set?
Yeah, I think we chose that one because it was broadly illustrative of a good chunk of the examples we had. And, again, you want to be careful of a lot of small numbers, but that was kind of a fairly generic path to purchase with respect to the user behavior there. And so I think what that means for people on the webinar is that, you may think users, and I'm probably a great example. I may think going into my vacation shopping plan that I have a good sense of where I want to go. But if you actually look at what I do, you'll see a very different story unfolding. And I think that's important to remember because, we tend to over ascribe like rationality to the consumer. And in fact, that's not the case, right? And so if 30% plus of people say that I was influenced by advertising, well, we know that the real number is probably higher. And you can see that kind of behavior in the path to purchase. And so, we went through, there are lots of examples that were pretty similar to that one.
Okay. Well, one more question. Well, unfortunately, there's a half dozen more questions here. We will pass them along to Expedia Media Solutions, and they'll be able to contact you. But we're sorry that we can't answer them all. One last question is: what factor does Expedia Media Solutions believe? What's your hypothesis about what draws a traveler to a particular brand? Such, you mentioned the example of Orbitz versus Expedia, in one of the path to purchases. What are factors that sort of draw travelers to one or the other?
Well, I guess I won't focus on the OTA side. I'll just talk more broadly. I mean, I think the answer is it depends. I think having a great brand, a great marketing strategy. I think customer loyalty is really important. A lot of companies out there, including a lot of our partners, have done a great job focusing on their shopping experience that they provide for consumers and looking at net promoter scores. I would also say that in this current context, having a really good mobile experience is critically important because that's oftentimes the first way a consumer might engage with your brand. And so if you're landing somebody on a mobile site that's not working properly, that might leave a bad taste in the consumer's mouth. And you only get so many bites at the apple, so to speak. So I think those are some of the factors. I don't think there's anything dramatically new in the sort of 2016, 2017 era with respect to how to think about brand and marketing and the customer. I'd say the biggest key differentiator now versus, let's say, 5 years ago is that mobile angle.
Mm-hmm. It was interesting how ad recall falls so heavily in the latter stages of the path to purchase. Is there anything advertisers can do to sort of combat that drop in influence?
Yeah, I mean, I think just be thoughtful about where you're investing your energies. And if you're heavily focused, at the bottom of the funnel, then I think you'd want to really maybe kind of rethink that. And if you're underinvested in the middle part of the funnel, well, why is that a conscious decision, or is that just because the tools that you know about and that you have at your disposal lend themselves more to the bottom of the funnel versus the middle of the funnel? But that's really the onus is really on the individual marketer to kind of be thoughtful, and if they need to go out and figure out how do I go after this part of the funnel, there are other tools and platforms like an Expedia Media Solutions, like other marketing companies out there that can really help you meet your goals.
We received several questions that were saying this data was just limited to a few countries. Do you expect the path to purchase future versions of it to expand to other geographies?
We'd love to be able to do that. We spent a lot of time talking to the various research firms, and one of the challenges we found was that there isn't great panel data in certain geographies. Like Asia Pacific is an area that we're really really interested in, and our goal is to find someone who can get the kind of comprehensive data that we need. And I didn't talk a lot about the statistics in the survey, but early on in the study, we talked a bit about confidence intervals and sample sizes. And so that's really tricky in certain geographies. And so you really want to make sure that the data you get is accurate, is meaningful, and doesn't, kind of lead people down the wrong path. But yeah, we'd love to expand it, and that's the goal.
That makes sense. Well, Matthew, thank you for the great presentation. Time is a factor, so we have to wrap up today's webinar. Everyone here will receive a video replay of today's webinar by email within about a day's time. You will also get a PDF of the slides. There was a lot of information, but you'll be able to share that with your colleagues and go back over the data. Thanks again for joining us, and hope you have a happy Friday tomorrow.